Elliot Norton Reviews. Tonight, Mr. Norton's guests are Al Pacino, Paul Benedict, and David Wheeler.
Good evening. Shakespeare's King Richard III is one of the most wildly theatrical melodramas ever written. About the historical hunchback Duke of Gloucester who murders his way to the throne of England by killing or having murdered his brother, his wife, his two young nephews, among others, and makes a bloody comical game of it, confiding in the audience as he proceeds in blood. With Al Pacino, who most people know principally as a movie star, as Richard. It's being presented now by the Theatre Company of Boston in the Church of the Covenant, which is on Newbury Street, and a production which has attracted national attention largely because Mr. Pacino is playing Richard. Al Pacino is here to talk about it. So is David Wheeler, who directed. So is Paul Benedict, who stands for the Duke of Buckingham, the principal aide in blood of Richard III. I think Al Pacino can start our discussion this evening. This production would have been impossible without his presence. And I think everyone would like to know how in the beginning he happened to decide to play King Richard III when he could be off in Italy or in Hollywood or one of those lovely sunny places playing something by a swimming pool. Al,
Well, first,
how'd you happen to do it?
I'm allergic to the sun. Well, I've always wanted to do Shakespeare, and I thought it was optional whether I did Richard or Hamlet or Iago in Othello. And talking to David, we discussed it, and I thought, well, let's go ahead and do Richard.
Mm. Had you seen it done? Had you ever seen
Never.
anybody do it? You never saw anybody do it?
I did the first half hour of it at the Actors Studio 3 or 4 years ago.
With whom? Was that on your own?
On my own.
You worked
I
it out
just
yourself?
worked it
No
out
director?
myself. No. The best way to do it.
What was your concept, David, when he said he would do it? You said Al Pacino in anything, and then from there on. What about the idea of the concept of doing it with an actor who hadn't done Shakespeare?
Well, I did think that the peculiar combination of values required by Richard III are very hard to come by, and that Al has them. You have to have a marvelous sense of humor for the in order to get to the audience. On the other hand, you have to have a great motor for subjective response, and that's there has to be a demon that gets to the works his way towards the crowd, and on the other hand, there has to be someone who's able to talk with an audience and enjoy himself hugely along the way.
Yeah.
And I thought, where else can we find such a person?
Yeah.
So.
What about the language, Al? Did you work on it at all? I mean, in the fact that it is Shakespearean language, and you've always worked in prose and modern contemporary.
I've always loved language. You see, I've always wanted to do a language play. I even found in the realistic plays I did, when I had enough to say, it would get my motor going. And I've always wanted to do that. I remember years ago just going over soliloquies of Hamlet and Macbeth, and just doing them in my room or anywhere I could. When I did scenes in acting class, I would usually pick scenes that were from Shakespeare. I just love the word. I've always loved it. And I've never had an opportunity to do it professionally. But language is something I always felt can be helpful. A lot of actors feel that language is something you go to. I feel language serves you as an actor, and it can be very helpful.
Are there passages in this that give you, that turn you on, stir you? What, for example?
The opening soliloquy, the various soliloquies in the play.
After Queen Anne, sure.
You'll find that any time I have more than a paragraph to say, I get, whether it's right or wrong, it just sort of moves in on me, because I find, interestingly enough, how little we use words today, especially on my day off when I go into New York. Or I meet people. The mouths are very lazy. We don't talk. And this opportunity to talk and say these things, I think is just great.
The opening soliloquy is, of course, one of the most beautiful and one of the most musical of them all. Incidentally, why on Saturday night did you do it with a little accent?
You never know.
Why did you suddenly say...
Saturday night is my accent night. I'll tell you that.
Now is the winter of our discontent.
I guess I was nervous.
I thought you had gone mafia.
I was nervous. When I get nervous on openings. And I didn't know it was opening until that night. So I was very nervous before it. I thought the first act was sort of, I was in and out because of nerves. And that will always affect my speech. But
really?
when I get behind, yeah.
You mean it can change the way you say things? Well, now, you spoke that speech beautifully, resonantly. You were deliberate, you were slow, you got all the melody into it. But I couldn't believe you were saying it in a kind of accent as though it was back to The Godfather or something.
That probably was because I was nervous.
Really?
And then, because or either that or sometimes when I'm very confident, the speech is very clear. Sometimes when I'm not too confident what the moment, or I don't really understand it fully. I'll slip and lose it. But it's why I'm working on it now.
The sound was good, the melody was good, and you sounded completely self-possessed because you said it so deliberately and you spaced it carefully.
Yeah.
I had the feeling that you were spacing it so that everybody hearing it for the first time would recognize what this is all about, which it is.
It's very hard to get what the play is doing right there at the beginning.
But with that Italian accent, I was completely thrown off. I thought you were going to do Iago at that particular point. Paul, you've never done, Richard, you've never done anything like the Duke of Buckingham before, have you?
The one full Shakespeare production I've done was an earlier Theatre Company of Boston production of Measure for Measure, which may live in infamy in your head, I'm not sure.
We don't mention that, do we, David?
Not very often.
I enjoyed it.
Paul was a marvelous Lucio. I laughed steadily when he was doing that part.
What about the Duke of Buckingham? One of the things about the play that bothered me a little on Saturday night was Buckingham decides to side with Richard for his own purposes,
Yes.
doesn't he? At what point does he or Richard decide that? This bothered me a little bit. I didn't have any sense that at one point Richard said to himself, this is the boy I'm going to use. No, he has to say that, doesn't he? In effect, I mean, not in the words, but he has to indicate that.
I think Buckingham makes the plunge, and Richard gladly accepts the help, knowing that he can manipulate this man without the man knowing it. That's my feeling.
The scene before they go into the king?
Those plans you laid talk of, you see, it's a very subtle thing that you say, and sometimes it isn't picked up. He has a line. How does it go again?
We may settle the point right out of the theater, I'm not sure. But the one thing I often feel about a good play is if it's a very good play, you can afford to be subtle. And if it's a shaky play, you must be obvious. And I find this play very good. I may be wrong.
Not a bad play. It's had a long run before.
This is true. There is a scene where twice in the play, in the early parts of the play, Richard talks and the Duke of Buckingham observes. And the way we have it staged now, they merely exchange looks. And finally, Buckingham makes a speech to a large group of people, one of whom is Richard, about a plan to rush to get the prince and bring him to London. And after everyone leaves, he calls Richard over and says, I'll tell you what, when they go, let us not stay here, let us go too, because on the road, I'm going to make a plan to separate those people from the prince. And that is the moment, and we try to play it there.
Also there, Paul, Buckingham does mention the fact that we've talked before, which isn't in the play.
Not in our production.
Oh, we left that out.
Yes. And I'm glad we did. But anyway, we hope that in that moment, one can see, Richard's next line is, my other self. And we try to use it as a surprise.
My counsel's consistory.
Yeah, my other self. Well, then that is the key line there, isn't it? I mean, when he sort of says, okay, you and I play on from here. One of the things that bothered me, one of the things I liked, let me tell you some of the things I liked. One of the things I liked was the way of addressing the audience in those initial speeches in which Richard takes the audience into his confidence and lets them know, I'm a villain, but I'm having a good time. You have a good time because I'm telling you what I'm doing, and enjoys it as a game. And I like the way that you do it so that you actually seem to be doing it eyeball to eyeball with people in the front row. Is this deliberate, too? I mean, you figured it out so that you could actually pick up individuals out of the audience? And
You know, a fantastic thing happened at the Loeb. Opening soliloquy. I looked out, and there was a hunchback woman.
Oh, my
looking up
God.
at me. It was so... But it's this kind of communication with an audience sometimes that can be very uplifting and fascinating. Because after all, I am talking to them. And sometimes I'll pick out people specifically, but in general, I'm talking to everybody that's there. I can't see. I saw you, I think.
Very conspicuous.
Well, I thought you were actually picking people out and that this had an effect on the soliloquy. Also, I had the feeling that you also made it comical and at the same time malevolent, which is the big trick, don't you think, David?
Absolutely.
You have to, you can't just be a playboy. You can't just, he's talking murder.
I found out something else that was very interesting. At one point when I come out in the second act and I talk to the audience and tell them that the son of Clarence have I pent up close, his daughter meanly have I matched in marriage, the sons of Edward sleep in Abraham's bosom, and Anne, my wife, hath bid this world good night. Now, I'm talking about the very things I did, and at one point, when I came out and I looked at the audience and I said that, I said, they've seen it all. What are they going to do to me? Are they going to come up on the stage now? And that reality came, and it was very powerful, and it helped me in that moment. Because they witnessed all this stuff. And
You have a sense of being close to the audience, do you?
at times,
Yeah.
I hope to get that.
This is one of the good things, that contact with the audience, and the maintaining of the balance between the monster, because the man is a monster. Then I thought it went soft on the throne scene when you dismissed Buckingham. When you get onto that throne, now before in some of those other things you play down, and then you work up, and then you let go with a big voice. Here, Richard is changing at this point, isn't he? He's now got what he's after, but he wants to keep it. And Buckingham, what is it? You call Buckingham, as I remember first, you call Buckingham and say to him about those boys in the tower. What is it? About the boys in the tower.
He tells the Duke of Buckingham, who up until this point in the play has become his second in command and has gone along with him as far as Richard has gone in his murders. He says, I want to kill the children, I want them dead. And Buckingham balks at it. He doesn't say no, but he balks. He's not sure what to do. And Richard says, I want an answer. And Buckingham says, give me a minute to think, and leaves. And then Richard, of course, just turns off on Buckingham and says, that's it.
Yeah.
And Buckingham comes back and to ask for the gift of the earldom promised him, and Richard won't deal with him and dismisses him, which in a sense is a death warrant, and that's the way it ends up.
But that's a key point there, in two ways, isn't it? I mean, number one, at this point, he's got what he wants, and now his big job is not to do any more. Well, he's got to make that one more murder of the kids, but he's now got to establish himself for good. He's got the power. And at that point, he turns away from Buckingham. He dismisses Buckingham, and he goes on alone. And also, it seems to me, from that point on, he no longer plays games with the audience. Isn't that right?
Well, that, in a sense, is what I was talking about, because that soliloquy that I was just talking about before happens after that.
Right after that.
Yeah.
Where it isn't the game anymore. It never was, though, as far as I'm concerned. Sort of, when you get to the metaphor of the play, it's sort of the way things are. I don't know, it's very, it's up for grabs right from the very beginning. There's that soliloquy in Henry VI, when Gloucester talks. I've often thought of using that, plus the Winter of Our Discontent at the beginning, when Gloucester talks about what he's going to do at the end of Henry VI.
Yeah. Olivier used that in the movie.
He did?
Yeah, he used the last part of Henry VI in the movie. He also uses some of the Crowley Sibber stuff with off with his head so much for Buckingham in that movie of Henry. Well, don't you think that there is a comic side to the original stuff, or do you think that's when he's confiding in the audience about the plots. Don't you think that's funny? Or do you think it's meant to be entirely malevolent and cold?
I think it's funny.
Yeah.
I think that's what comes across. I can't. I'm not playing it that way. It just comes to me. I think it is one of the things I say.
Well, then you're saying, you're talking in terms of a metaphor. You're saying Richard III is a metaphor for modern man. Is that what you're saying? That this kind of cruel, malevolent...
Well, this struggle for power, this deception, this mendacity, you know, that runs through the play. I think
it's one of the reasons we put the section in which he persuades the citizens to want him for king into a public hall and with a microphone to sort to bring to mind the way the media is used today to persuade people that they have the right man.
Look at characters like Buckingham and Derby and people like this who are really on the fence and get their just desserts. But I've been thinking a lot like Richard lately.
Don't get carried away too much. What about the costumes? David, I was troubled by the costume. What's the point of the costume?
Well, we started when we were in the Loeb. We decided that we would be our contemporary creatures in something that was a T-shirt, inconspicuous, but nevertheless a modern garb. But over it, a symbol of the rank in Elizabethan day. That's to say, the Duke would have a cape and a medallion, possibly, and whereas the lower classes would just have the T-shirts, those who had rank would carry something further. We begged and borrowed these Elizabethan elements, and then when we got everything assembled, our costumer, who was very able and very bright, looked at what we had on stage and said, "Really, what we've begged and borrowed doesn't add up," and we kind of drowned the actors, and particularly of course the women had to have full costumes. It's very hard to have a costume element above a modern garb for a woman. So we decided then when we moved to the church with such a marvelous setting with so much to see behind, that we would then cut out the actors could cut out a smaller space in modern dress, but we also switched our costumer left, and we had to find another person, and we really haven't got it all together coordinated, I think you could say at this point.
One of the things we wanted to do, I guess, which I don't think we've succeeded in doing, is hoping that some of the costumes would tell the actors who they are. Like, for instance, my costume I'm not satisfied with yet, and I'm still trying to, it's changed 3 times. I still haven't found something that I feel is right. But the whole rehearsal process of this play, which was very interesting, I thought, came to an abrupt end at one point, simply because of time. But we were exploring and finding things. And that's when I talk about the word metaphor, when I talk about the metaphor of Richard, because I felt that we were really getting close to it in rehearsal. That we were dealing with something that was surprising all of us. We were getting into the... And then we had to prepare for production, you know, quote unquote. Yeah. And that brought a lot of... First of all, it brought all these costumes, and we saw them, gowns and things that weren't related to what we were doing. And then we had to adjust to that. And then when we thought, well, that's not working, we'd go back to modern dress, but the modern dress...
Sort of trying to refine the rehearsal situations.
But some of the moments, I think, that are in the play that are exciting, there are a lot of moments, I think, that are, but some of them came out of rehearsal, and they would have never been, I don't think, found unless we rehearsed this way. But the unfortunate thing is that we wish we had, I know I could say this over and over again because everybody does, but especially with a play like Richard III, you know, time is very important. And I think we were into a territory that was really new and exciting, and it helped us, but I think we could have gone further in that direction.
Well, it does every once in a while. It comes up very exciting. For example, the scene in which all the messengers are rushing in at you, and they're all excited. Now that's nicely staged. And I think your reaction to that of coolness that becomes coldness, that becomes anger, that suggests to me the kind of power that that particular man had to have in those situations. These people are panicky. He's contemptuous of panic because he himself is strong in his own particular way. Now, theatrically, that's a very exciting thing. You left out Margaret, whom we miss only because she's a magnificent cursor, of course. But you also left out the scene about at the end where Richard and Richmond both see Richard's, the ghosts of those people that Richard has killed. Now, I feel that that was a big loss for one reason, because after that scene, Richard has a feeling of remorse. There's one beautiful speech of remorse and fear, which I think the only place in the play brings him down to the point where you really begin to feel sorry for him that he's gone too far. Now, did you say you were?
Yes, we're probably getting that back in. We experimented with that a little, and then with production pressures, we dropped the whole staging of the ghost sequence. But we had decided that as soon as we got spare time, we'd bring it back in. Of course, we have a couple replacements to put in immediately, but nevertheless, we
You had cast problems. And
yes, Margaret's
and
curse, we've liked to say, has been on the production, sickness and
a little
difficulty.
flu problem with Al.
We also had a Margaret.
Originally.
Oh, you had a Margaret, yeah.
She had nightmares and asked that she be allowed to leave.
Really? I mean, she found it too tough to be that wicked old woman, huh?
Well, I guess it was partly that and partly the acting process by then had got to her.
It is tough.
Margaret tends to slow it down, as a matter of fact, I think. But that language, now you say you love language.
Oh,
Margaret's speeches, those
I wanted
Al-
it in. I also thought it did a lot for Richard too. It's the first time somebody really talks about Richard. A good time too.
At one point, Richard gets a little choked up with one of those curses of Margaret. But there's a beautiful scene in there, a beautiful speech by Richard right after he sees those ghosts.
Yes.
You know that lovely speech in which he says, "I haven't been frightened like this before." He says to Radcliffe. And then he says, "Who, when I die, who will, in effect, who will pity me? Nobody, because I don't even pity myself." And that reduces the play. I think that not reduces it, it elevates the character of Richard so you can understand it. I mean, you can tie it back in pity. There's some sense of pity anyway because of the man is a misfit. He's a physical misfit. That's part of it. I mean, apart from the universal metaphor of the people who prey on the world, there is the also universal metaphor, I think, of the people who are afflicted by nature and have to struggle their way out of it. And that's one side, that's one way in which Richard, if you play him to that extent, Richard does have that quality. He finally reveals it, that he's the guy who has been badly treated by nature. How do you feel about that?
That's one of my favorite speeches, if not my favorite, and the reason is that's the speech that includes the line, "There is no one loves me." And it's the speech, I think, wherein if 6 different actors play Richard, that is the speech wherein they're going to find the why of their man and the reasons, and they're going to find what the motivation is for all the acts he's done, I think. And they're all going to find them different in that speech.
Yeah.
It's a marvelous speech.
Have you tried it? Have you done this speech?
Yes.
Did you do it in rehearsal?
Very well, I might add. Beautifully.
We just couldn't work out the scene, and like David said before, it was a matter of time.
You mean
We've been talking about that for the last week, about putting it back in. We wanted to put it back in for opening. But we will have it in, I think, this week.
Well, the problem then is mechanically setting it up. Is that it, David?
And getting the ghosts operative.
Getting well, you've got a free stage there. You've got a big open stage. You know, that's not a bad stage, despite the fact that it's enormously high vaulted for sound. It's bad for that.
I know, it's...
But you can get a lot of free movement in there.
Yes, and there is a marvelous cyclorama with that, the apse of the church.
And you can get
Pulpit,
not only...
the pulpit is interesting, I think, in the way it's used.
It was interesting when Al had his chin on it in the beginning. That really gave us a bird's eye view of the whole thing. But you can create there without any scenery. You can create the whole illusion of anything you want, which you need in Shakespeare anyway, don't you? I would think of you not to hammer at that one particular poor speech, but as long as Paul likes it as much as I do, I would think if you could, if that scene we're in, you could gear your performance also to that particular time, if you can feel at that particular point that Richard is a man who is picked on, has been picked on by the world. That business about...
You really see his loneliness at that point, his isolation.
Yeah.
I think it's really important, and I think we're going to use it.
Yeah, we were thinking that what we had done was to find the behavior that creates the isolation and the desperation there at the very end. And something like, for example, we put in the murder of Catesby, the killing of Catesby in the very end of his last lie, to demonstrate it, but we hadn't given the thoughts that went behind it.
I think there's a line in one of the in that early soliloquy in which he said, "Scarce half made up, and that's so unfashionably that dogs bark at me as I pass by," something like that.
Right, that's the first.
Well, this man is a monster, the most malevolent monster, I think, suppose, in all dramatic literature. But that one line has always struck me as a heartbreaking thing.
Yes.
The man is not only not only a monster physically, but he knows it, and he knows it so he can say it. I think when you reach the point where you know it to that extent and you can say it out, dogs bark at me as I pass them by. That kind of bitterness comes from something that is genuinely disconcerting. I think everybody under those circumstances is entitled to be a little bit on the bitter side.
True.
Do you feel better at it now than when you started, Al? Do you feel it's been a good, enriching experience?
Oh, yes, I feel it now. I just keep doing it because every performance I'm finding out things, talking about it. It's sort of a great preparation to do it. That's what I thought. You know, you have to do it once in order to do it.
Yeah.
You know, with some of these parts, I think it's important. I think at this time of my life, if I do it again, it won't be for a while, but I found out so much about it, and I think it's been very, very helpful.
I think it's an enriching thing. After all, you can always play the son of the Godfather and do it beautifully. But you're going to be able, in another year or two, to play this and knock it off completely, and you're going to be able to play Hamlet or Macbeth or Iago or one of those things. And since you have the potential power to do it, you should. And I admire your courage.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
You have just heard Elliot Norton in conversation with director David Wheeler and actors Al Pacino and Paul Benedict, who are currently performing in the Theatre Company of Boston's production of Shakespeare's Richard III at Church of the Covenant in Boston. Mr. Norton is drama critic of the Boston Herald-American and the Sunday Herald Advertiser and appears through the courtesy of those newspapers. Mr. Norton is also professor of dramatic literature at Boston University. Elliot Norton Reviews is recorded in the studios of WGBH Boston.